Chapter 1, Year 1760. The Anno Domini 1760 was remarkable for three things in the parish of Dalmailing. First and foremost, there was my placing, then the coming of Mrs. Malcolm with her 5 children to settle among us, and next my marriage upon my own cousin, Miss Betty Lanshaw, by which the accounted this year naturally divides itself into 3 heads or portions. First, of the placing. It was a great affair, for I was put in by the patron, and the people knew nothing whatsoever of me, and their hearts were stirred into strife on the occasion, and they did all that lay within the compass of their power to keep me out, insomuch that there was obliged to be a guard of soldiers to protect the presbytery. And it was a thing that made my heart grieve when I heard the drum beating and the fife playing as we were going to the kirk. The people were really mad and vicious, and flung dirt upon us as we passed, and reviled us all, and held out the finger of scorn at me. But I endured it with a resigned spirit, compassionating their wilfulness and blindness. Poor old Mr. Culfuddy of the Bray Hill got such a clash of glare on the side of his face that his eye was almost extinguished. When we got to the kirk door, it was found to be nailed up, so as by no possibility to be opened. The sergeant of the soldiers wanted to break it, but I was afraid that the heritors would grudge and complain at the expense of a new door, and I supplicated him to let it be as it was. We were therefore obligated to go in by a window, and the crowd followed us in the most unreverent manner, making the Lord's house like an inn on a fair day with their grievous yelly hooing. During the time of the psalm and the sermon, they behaved themselves better, but when the induction came on, their clamour was dreadful, and Thomas Thorrell the weaver, a pious zealot in that time, he got up and protested and said, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, that he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same as a thief and a robber." And I thought I would have a hard and sore time of it with such an outstrapulous people. Mr. Given, that was then the minister of Lugton, was a jocose man, and would have his joke even on a Sunday, even at a solemnity. When the laying of the hands upon me was a-doing, he could not get near enough to put on his, but he stretched out his staff and touched my head and said, to the great diversion of the rest, "This will do well enough, timber to timber." But it was an unfriendly saying of Mr. Given, considering the time and the place and the temper of my people. After the ceremony, we then got out at the window, and it was a heavy day to me, but we went to the manse, and there we had an excellent dinner, which Mrs. Watts of the New Inns of Irville prepared at my request, and sent her chaise driver to serve, for he was likewise her waiter, she having then but one chaise, and that no often called for. But although my people received me in this unruly manner, I was resolved to cultivate civility among them, and therefore the very next morning I began a round of visitations. But oh, it was a steep brae that I had to climb, and it needed a stout heart. For I found the doors in some places barred against me. In others, the bairns, when they saw me coming, ran crying to their mothers, "Here's the feckless mess, John." And then when I went into their houses, the parents would no ask me to sit down, but in a scornful way said, "Honest man, what's your pleasure here?" Nevertheless, I walked about from door to door like a dejected beggar till I got the almost deed of a civil reception. And who would have thought it from no less a person than the same Thomas Thorrell that was so bitter against me in the kirk the foregoing day? Thomas was standing at the door with his green duffel apron and his red Kilmarnock nightcap. I mind him as well as if it was but yesterday, and he had seen me going from house to house, and in what manner I was rejected, and his bowels were moved, and he said to me in a kind manner, "Come in, sir, and ease yourself. This'll never do. The clergy are God's gorbies, and for their master's sake it behoves us to respect them. There was no aim in the whole parish mair against you than mysel, but this early visitation is a symptom of grace that I couldn't have expected from a bird out the nest of patronage." I thanked Thomas and went in with him, and we had some solid conversation together, and I told him that it was not so much the pastor's duty to feed the flock as to herd them well, and although there might be some abler with the head than me, there wasna a he within the bounds of Scotland more willing to watch the fold by night and by day. And Thomas said he had not heard a mere sound observe it for some time, and if I held to that doctrine in the pulpit, it wouldna be long till I could work a change. I was minded, quoth he, never to set my foot within the kirk door while you were there, but to testify, and no to condemn without a trial. I'll be there the next Lord's Day, and I'll egg my neighbours to be likewise, so you'll no have to preach just to the bare woes and the laird's family. I now have to speak of the coming of Mrs. Malcolm. She was the widow of a Clyde shipmaster that was lost at sea with his vessel. She was a genty body, calm and methodical. From morning to night she sat at her wheel, spinning the finest lint which suited well with her pale hands. She never changed her widow's weeds, and she was aye as if she had just been ta'en out of a bandbox. The tear was often in her ee when the bairns were at the school, but when they came home her spirit was lighted up with gladness, although, poor woman, she had many a time very little to give them. They were, however, wonderful well-bred things, and took with thankfulness whatever she set before them, for they knew that their father, the breadwinner, was away, and that she had to work sore for their bit and drap. I dare say the only vexation that she ever had from any of them on their own account was when Charlie, the eldest laddie, had won 4pence at pitch and toss at the school, which he brought home with a proud heart to his mother. I happened to be donrin by at that time, and just looked in at the door to say good night. It was a sad sight. There was she, sitting with a silent tear in her cheek, and Charlie greeting as if he'd done a great fault, and the other 4 looking on with sorrowful faces. Never, I am sure, did Charlie Malcolm gamble after that night. I often wondered what brought Mrs. Malcolm to Clachan instead of going to a populous town where she might have taken up a huckstery shop, as she was but of a silly constitution, which would have been better for her than spinning from morning to far into the night, as if she was in verity drawing the thread of life. But it was no doubt from an honest pride to hide her poverty, for when her daughter Effie was ill with the measles, the poor lassie was very ill. Nobody thought she would come through, and when she did get the turn, she was for many days a heavy handful. Our session being rich, and nobody on it but crippled Tammy Dadles, that was at that time known all through the countryside for begging on a horse, I thought it my duty to call upon Mrs. Malcolm in a sympathising way and offer some assistance, but she refused it. No, sir, said she, I cannot take help from the poor's box, although it's very true that I am in great need, for it might hereafter be cast up to my bairns, whom it may please God to restore to better circumstances when I am no to see it. But I would fain borrow £5, and if, sir, you will write to Mr. Maitland, that is now Lord Provost of Glasgow, and tell him that Marion Shaw would be obliged to him for the lend of that sum, I think he will not fail to send it. I wrote the letter that night to Provost Maitland, and by the return of the post I got an answer with £20 for Mrs. Malcolm, saying that it was with sorrow he heard so small a trifle could be serviceable. When I took the letter and the money, which was in a bank bill, she said, "This is just like himself." She then told me that Mr. Maitland had been a gentleman's son of the East Country, but driven out of his father's house when a laddie by his stepmother, and that he had served as a servant lad with her father, who was the Laird of Yilcogie, but ran through his estate and left her, his only daughter, in little better than beggary, with her auntie, the mother of Captain Malcolm, her husband that was. Provost Maitland, in his servitude, had ta'en a notion of her, and when he recovered his patrimony and had become a great Glasgow merchant, on hearing how she was left by her father, he offered to marry her. But she had promised herself to her cousin the captain, whose widow she now was. He then married a rich lady, and in time grew, as he was, Lord Provost of the city. But this letter, with the £20 to me, showed that he had not forgotten his first love. It was a short but well-written letter in a fair hand of write, containing much of the true gentleman, and Mrs. Malcolm said, "Who knows, but out of the regard he once had for their mother, he may do something for my 5 helpless orphans." Thirdly, upon the subject of taking my cousin Miss Betty Lanshaw for my first wife, I have little to say. It was more out of a compassionate, habitual affection than the passion of love. We were brought up by our grandmother in the same house, and it was a thing spoken of from the beginning that Betty and me were to be married. So when she heard that the Laird of Breadland had given me the presentation of Dalmailing, she began to prepare for the wedding. And as soon as the placing was well over and the manse in order, I gaed to Ayr where she was, and we were quietly married and came home in a chaise, bringing with us her little brother Andrew that died in the East Indies, and he lived and was brought up by us. Now, this is all I think that happened in that year worthy of being mentioned, except that at the sacrament, when old Mr. Colfuddy was preaching in the tent, it came on such a thunderplump that there was not a single soul stayed in the kirkyard to hear him, for which he was greatly mortified and never after came to our preachings.
This reading is from chapter 5, the year 1764, because one of the duties of the minister and his elders was to police the morals of the parish, and if someone was found guilty of a breach, then he or she had to stand in the kirk during Sunday service to be publicly chastised by the minister. And this is what happened on one such occasion. In this, the hand of Providence was very visible, and lucky for me it was that I had sent for Mr. Auld when I did send, as the very week following a sound began to spread in the parish that one of my lassies had got herself with bairn, which was an awful thing to think had happened in the house of her master, and that master a minister of the gospel. Some there were, for backbiting appertaineth to all conditions, that jaloused and wondered if I had not a finger in the pie, which, when Mr. Auld heard, he bestirred himself in such a manful and godly way in my defence as silenced the clash, telling that I was utterly incapable of any such thing, being a man of a guileless heart and a spiritual simplicity that would be ornamental in a child. We then had the Labyrinth summoned before the session, and was not long of making her confess that the father was Nichol Snipe, Lord Glencairn's gamekeeper, and both her and Nichol were obligated to stand in the kirk. But Nichol was a graceless reprobate, for he came with two coats, one button behind him and another button before him, and two wigs of my lord's, lent him by the valet de chamber, the one over his face and the other in the right way, and he stood with his face to the church wall. When I saw him from the pulpit, I said to him, "Nichol, you must turn your face towards me." At the which he turned round, to be sure, but there he presented the same show as his back. I was confounded, and did not know what to say, but cried out with a voice of anger, "Nichol, Nichol, if ye had been all back, you would nae have been here this day," which had such an effect on the whole congregation that the poor fellow suffered afterwards more derision than if I had rebuked him in the manner prescribed by the session.
So I'm reading from chapter 18 for the year 1777. This may well be called the year of the heavy heart, for we had sad tidings of the lads that went away as soldiers to America. First, there was a boding in the minds of all their friends that they were never to see them more, and their sadness, like a mist spreading from the waters and covering the fields, darkened the spirit of the neighbours. Secondly, a sign was bruited about that the king's forces would have a hot and sore struggle before the rebels were put down, if they were ever put down. Then came the cruel truth of all that the poor lad's friends had feared. But it is fit and proper that I should relate at length, under their several heads, the sorrows and the afflictions as they came to pass. One evening, as I was taking my walk home, meditating my course for the next Sabbath, it was shortly after Candlemas. It was a fine, clear, frosty evening, just as the sun was setting. Taking my walk alone and thinking of the dreadfulness of Almighty power, and how that if it was not tempered and restrained by infinite goodness and wisdom and mercy, the miserable sinner man and all the things that live would be in a woeful state. I drew near the bield where old widow Merkland lived by herself, who was grandmother to Jock Hempy, the Ramplar lad that was second who took on for a soldier. I did not mind of this at the time, but passing the house, I heard the croon, as it were, of a laden soul, Busy with the Lord, and, not to disturb the holy workings of grace, I paused and listened. It was old Mizzy Merkland herself, sitting at the gable of the house, looking at the sun setting in all his glory behind the Arran Hills. But she was not praying, only moaning to herself, and oozing out, as it might be called, of the spirit from her heart, then grievously oppressed with sorrow and heavy bodements of grey hairs and poverty.
So I'm going to read from chapter 29, which takes us to the year 1788, partly because of my interest in Glasgow in the 18th century and the way that Glasgow very much influences the parish in this chapter. It had often been remarked by ingenious men that the Brawl burn, which ran through the parish, though a small, was yet a rapid stream, and had a wonderful capability for damming and to turn mills. From the time that the Irville water deserted its channel, this brook grew into repute, and several mills and dams had been erected on its course. In this year, a proposal came from Glasgow to build a cotton mill on its banks beneath the Witch Lynn, which being on a corner of the wheat rig, the property of Mr. Cayenne, he not only consented thereto, but took a part in the profit or loss therein, and being a man of great activity, though we thought him for many a day a serpent plague sent upon the parish, he proved thereby one of our greatest benefactors. The cotton mill was built, and a spacious fabric it was. Nothing like it had been seen before in our day and generation, and for the people that were brought to work in it, a new town was built in the vicinity, which Mr. Cayenne, the same being founded on his land, called Cayenneville, the name of the plantation in Virginia that had been taken from him by the rebellious Americans. From that day, fortune was lavish of her favours upon him. His property swelled and grew in the most extraordinary manner, and the whole countryside was stirring with a new life. Some of the ancient families in their turreted houses were not pleased with this innovation, especially when they saw the handsome dwellings that were built for the weavers of the mills and the unstinted hand that supplied the wealth required for the carrying on of the business. It sank their pride into insignificance, and many of them would almost rather have wanted the rise that took place in the value of their lands than have seen this incoming of what they called ore-sea speculation. But saving the building of the cotton mill and the beginning of Cayenneville, nothing more memorable happened in this year. Still, it was nevertheless a year of a great activity. The minds of men were excited to new enterprises. A new genius, as it were, had descended upon the earth.
Chapter 31, 1790. But just to remind you that chapter 30 was 1789, a year in which the whole of Europe rocked and was convulsed. And yet for Balwhidder, this I have always reflected upon as one of our blessed years. It was not remarkable for any extraordinary occurrence, but there was a hopefulness in the minds of men. And you jump from that straight into chapter 31, 1790. And Balwhidder, out for a walk, stumbles across a bookshop. I beheld a bookseller's shop opened with sticks of red and black wax, pouncet boxes, pens, pocketbooks, new publications in the window, such as the like of which was only to be seen in cities and borough towns. And it was lighted at night by a patent lamp, which shed a wonderful beam, burning oil and having no smoke. The man sold likewise perfumery, powder puffs, trinkets, Dublin dolls, penknives, Castile soap, walking sticks, and a prodigy of other things too tedious to mention. Upon conversing with the man, for I was enchanted to go into this phenomenon, for no less could I regard it, he told me that he had a correspondence with London. He could get me down any book published there within the same month in which it came out. And he showed me divers of the newest, which I didn't even read about in the Scots magazine till more than 3 months later. But what I was most surprised to learn was that he took in a daily London newspaper for the spinners and weavers, who paid him a penny apiece a week for the same, they being all greatly taken up with what at the time was going on in France. This strikes me as Galt at his absolute best. Here's Balwhidder who finds a bookshop opened in his own parish without him apparently noticing. And he tells us everything in the bookshop, except, you'll notice, books. And he tells us that he's fascinated by the Castile soap and the powder puffs, but the working men are fascinated by what was going on at the time in France, and they're prepared to pay a penny a week out of their miserable wages to find out, not for a newspaper, but for a London newspaper. Galt is showing us just in these 2 paragraphs the changes that are about to swallow Scotland, swallow Britain, and swallow the whole of Europe. And he does it through the apparently guileless mind of Balwhidder.
I'm reading a short passage from 1798, which of course is a notable year for the Irish Rebellion. This is what Balwhidder has to say about one of the events. The alarm of the Irish Rebellion in this year was likewise another source of affliction to us, for many of the gentry coming over in great straits, especially the ladies and their children, and some of them in the hurry of their flight having but little ready money, were very ill off. Some 4 or 5 families came to the Cross Keys in the situation, and the conduct of Mr. Cayenne to them was most exemplary. He remembered his own haste with his family from Virginia when the Americans rebelled, and immediately on hearing of these Irish refugees, he waited on them with his wife and daughter, supplied them with money, invited them to his house, made ploys to keep up their spirits, while the other gentry stood back till they knew something of the strangers. Among these destitute ladies was a Mrs. Desmond and her 2 daughters, a woman of a most august presence, being indeed more like one ordained to reign over a kingdom than for household purposes. The Miss Desmonds were only entering their teens, but they also had no ordinary stamp upon them. What made this party the more particular was on account of Mr. Desmond, who was supposed to be a united man with the rebels, and it was known his son was deep in their plots. Yet although this was all told to Mr. Cayenne by some of the other Irish ladies who were of the loyal connection, it made no difference to him, but on the contrary, he acted as if he thought the Desmonds the most of all the refugees entitled to his hospitable civilities. This was a wonderment to our straight-laced narrow lairds, as there was not a man of such strict government principles in the whole countryside as Mr. Cayenne. But he said he carried his political principles only to the camp and the council. To the hospital and the prison, said he, I take those of a man, which was almost a Christian doctrine. And from that declaration, Mr. Cayenne and me began again to draw a little more cordially together, although he had still a very imperfect sense of religion, which I attributed to his being born in America, where even as yet, I am told, they have but a scanty sprinkling of grace. And I like the passage because of its overcoming partisanship.
Yeah, I've got Bob's nice new addition. So I'm going to be reading the year 1801, which is a kind of potted biography of Colin Mavis that I think distills in quite an interesting way some of the ideas in the novel as a whole. It is often to me very curious food for meditation that as the parish increased in population, there should have been less cause for matter to record. Things that in former days would have occasioned great discourse and cogitation are forgotten with the day in which they happen, and there is no longer that searching into personalities which was so much in vogue during the first epoch of my ministry, which I reckon the period before the American War. Nor has there been any such germinal changes among us as those which took place in the second epoch, counting backward from the building of the cotton mill that gave rise to the town of Cayenneville. But still we were not, even at this era, of which this Anno Domini is the beginning, without occasional personality or an event that deserved to be called a germinal. Some years before, I had noted among the callans at Mr. Lorimer's school a long supple laddie, who, like all bairns that grow fast and tall, had but little smeddum. He could not be called a dolt,
for he was observant and thoughtful and given to asking sagacious questions, but there was a sleepiness about him, especially in the kirk, and he gave, as the master said, but little application to his lessons, so that folk thought he would turn out a sort of gaunt at the door, more mindful of meat than work. He was, however, a good-natured lad, and when I was taking my solitary walks of meditation, I sometimes fell in with him, sitting alone on the brae by the waterside, and sometimes lying on the grass with his hands under his head on the sunny green knolls where Mr. Cylinder, the English engineer belonging to the cotton work, has built the bonny house that he calls Dairy Hill Cottage. This was when Colin Mavis was a laddie at the school, and when I spoke to him, I was surprised at the discretion of his answers, so that gradually I began to think and say that there was more about Colin than the neighbours knew. Nothing, however, for many a day came out to his advantage, so that his mother, who was by this time a widow woman, did not well know what to do with him, and folk pitied her heavy handful of such a drowd. By and by, however, it happened that one of the young clerks at the cotton mill shattered his right-hand thumb by a gun bursting, and being no longer able to write, was sent into the army to be an ensign, which caused a vacancy in the office. And through the help of Mr. Cayenne, I got Colin Mavis into the place, where, to the surprise of everybody, he proved a wonderful ident and active lad, and from less to more has come at the head of all the clerks and deep in the confidentials of his employers. But although this was a great satisfaction to me and to the widow woman his mother, it somehow was not so much to the rest of the parish, who seemed, as it were, angry that poor Colin had not proved himself such a dolt as they had expected and foretold. Now, among other ways that Colin had of spending his leisure was that of playing music on an instrument, in which it was said he made a wonderful proficiency. But being long and thin and of a delicate habit of body, he was obligated to refrain from this recreation. So he betook himself to books, and from reading he began to try writing. But as this was done in a corner, nobody jealoused what he was about, till one evening in this year he came to the manse and asked a word in private with me. I thought that perhaps he had fallen in with a lass and was come to consult me anent matrimony. But when we were by ourselves in my study, he took out of his pocket a number of the Scots magazine and said, "Sir, you have been long pleased to notice me more than any other body, and when I got this, I could not refrain from bringing it to let you see it. You maun ken, sir, that I have been long in secret given to trying my hand at rhyme, and wishing to ascertain what others thought of my power in that way, I sent, by the post, 2 or 3 verses to the Scots magazine, and they have not only inserted them, but placed them in the body of the book in such a way that I kenna what to think." So I looked at the magazine and read his verses, which were certainly very well-made verses for one who had no regular education. But I said to him, as the Greenock magistrate said to John Wilson, the author of Clyde, when they stipulated with him to give up the art, that poem-making was a profane and unprofitable trade, and he would do well to turn his talent to something of more solidity, which he promised to do. But he has since put out a book whereby he has angered all those that had foretold he would be a do-nae good. Thus has our parish walked sidey for sidey with all the national improvements, having an author of its own and getting a literary character in the ancient and famous Republic of Letters.
I'm reading from chapter 50, and the year is 1809. As I come towards the events of these latter days, I am surprised to find myself not at all so distinct in my recollection of them as in those of the first of my ministry, being apt to confound the things of one occasion with those of another, which Mrs. Balwhidder says is an admonishment to me to leave off my writing. But please God, I will endeavour to fulfil this, as I have through life tried, to the best of my capacity, to do every other duty. And with the help of Mrs. Balwhidder, who has a very clear understanding, I think I may get through my task in a creditable manner, which is all I aspire after, not writing for a vain world, but only to testify to posterity anent the great changes that have happened in my day and generation, a period which all the best informed writers say has not had its match in the history of the world since the beginning of time. By the failure of the Cotton Mill Company, whose affairs were not settled till the spring of this year, there was great suffering during the winter. But my people, those that still adhered to the establishment, bore their share of the dispensation with meekness and patience. Nor was there wanting edifying monuments of resignation, even among the strayvaggers. On the day that the Cannae meeting house was opened, which was in the summer, I was smitten to the heart to see the empty seats that were in my kirk, for all the thoughtless, and some that I had a better opinion of, went to hear the opening discourse. Satan that day had power given him to buffet me, as he did Job of old. And when I looked around and saw the empty seats, my corruption rose, and I forgot myself in the remembering prayer. For when I prayed for all denominations of Christians and worshippers and infidels, I could not speak of the schismatics with patience, but entreated the Lord to do with the hobble show at Cayenville as he saw meet in his displeasure, the which, when I came afterwards to think upon, I grieved at with a sore contrition. In the course of the week following, the elders in a body came to me in the manse, and after much commendation of my godly ministry, they said that seeing I was now growing old, they thought that they could not testify their respect for me in a better manner than by agreeing to get me a helper. But I would not at that time listen to such a proposal, for I felt no falling off in my powers of preaching. On the contrary, I found myself growing better at it, as I was enabled to hold forth in an easy manner, often a whole half hour longer than I could do a dozen years before. Therefore, nothing was done in this year anent my resignation, but during the winter, Mrs. Balwhidder was often grieved in the bad weather that I should preach, and in short, so worked upon my affections that I began to think it was fitting for me to comply with the advice of my friends. Accordingly, in the course of the winter, the elders began to cast about for a helper, and during the bleak weather in the ensuing spring, several young men spared me from the necessity of preaching.